Okay, welcome everybody to week 4 of RST 161 World Religions. This week's video lecture is on the topic of Buddhism. So the presentation today is entitled Buddhism, Its Core Teachings and Varieties. And I just basically, per normal custom, I want to look at some of the things that were brought up in the textbook and just clarify and emphasize certain points, both from the textbook and as well as from the supplemental resources. So the readings from Sogyal Rinpoche, from the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, and then also from Pema Chodron, as well as the video that we saw from Minda Lee Kumar, the so-called enthusiastic Buddhist. So she had touched upon the Four Noble Truths in that video. So I hope to touch upon each of these different sources at some point in this lecture, and then just clarify and kind of reinforce some of the main concepts that come out of Buddhism. So one of the first things to consider when we're looking at Buddhism is that this is based on the historical life. So this is understood by scholars to be a historical personage, and he's said to have lived, been born in basically what is now today kind of on the border of Nepal, South Nepal and northern India. So kind of in the Himalayan foothills there. And he went about in his life and he, searched for truth and for liberation. And then eventually when he found that and he so-called gained nirvana, he ended up coming up with teachings that he shared, and he would, for a long career, he would go around India and shared his Buddhist teachings with everyone, and these were called the Dharma. So we're going to look at this, and also it's important to know from the outset that coming from this Indic religious tradition, or Indic religious context rather, a lot of the same concepts we saw that were similar, that we were introduced to last week with Hinduism, reappear here in this context. So some of the core concepts of karma, law of cause and effect, and of action that comes back to an individual, of a samsara, the notion of this cycle of a wheel of birth and rebirth, and then that also entailing reincarnation. So these are all, and there's many other concepts that are actually constant between, or stable, that the Buddha actually upholds when we get around to his teachings, which come later. Now, it's important to know some of the foundational ways in which Buddhism is unique, and so we'll explore these more as this presentation progresses. But one of the ways is that this is called a Shramanic tradition, and what Shramanic means is it's a word that means self-effort in Sanskrit. And the notion here is that we cannot rely upon external means for our liberation or for our spiritual awakening. It's totally up to us. It's totally up to our own efforts and our own introspection and our own ethical action in the world to be able to kind of advance along that path of awakening. So we see that's different in the case of Hinduism. At least a lot of again, Hinduism has many different paths, but emphasized within a lot of different, a variety of different paths, Hindu pathways. There's a notion of grace coming from a deity. There's a notion of being in Dharma with the rest of the universe, which kind of brings a sort of empowerment that carries with it. Going back to Vedic times, you have ritual that the Brahmins still perform. You can nowadays it's a lot of times focusing on different deities, but in Vedic times it would be, to basically, you could say, to this cosmic order itself. It would be this, having sacrifice would sort of renew the world. So here we have all these different ways that grace, and if you do certain actions, it can bring a person a sort of spiritual empowerment. And this is something that the Buddha, in his teachings, really rejects. And it's important to note that this is also something that the Jain tradition, which I touched upon in the final slides in the last lecture, this is also a Shramanic tradition where they believe also that it's totally our own self-effort that we were able to grow or spiritually progress, so to speak. So, like if you go into a Jain temple, there may be icons of different deities, and a lot of times these are actually not so much deities as they are called Tirthankaras. So basically, people that had, like the Buddha, had gained liberation through their own self efforts. And so there's a largely a kind of, it's not, you're not going to the temple, or if in the case of a lot of Buddhist temples, you're not going to the temple to receive grace, so much as kind of pay homage to the legacy of the Buddha, and then take the symbolic um, teachings, or take the symbolic imagery and just absorb it, and then let that be kind of more of an inspiration, um, to replicate that same path. Um, so there are exceptions to that, as we see in Mahayana Buddhism, as the chapter points out. But just in in the core teachings that we see from the Buddha, we do have this really strong notion that you kind of have to, everything, it's up to you, in your own spiritual efforts in order to gain awakening. So there's other aspects, like the Buddha was against the animal sacrifice, so he taught, um, he was advocated for nonviolence in various ways. And he was, again, also rejected the ritual aspect of Brahmanic Hinduism. And then he also, with his middle path teachings, he rejects the notion of Hindu austerity, where going to these great extremes, and you see that in the Jain tradition as well, where going to these great extremes has a value. In his own story of enlightenment, and then in his teachings, he actually says that a path of moderation is far more excuse me, far more preferable. And then lastly, in Hinduism, a very common teaching is Atman, that we all have a soul, and then that soul is kind of connected to this larger divine Brahman. So you could, some Hindus will maybe translate that as God, or totality of being. Higher reality is another way that gets translated. But the real core notion is that every party has a spark of that, and it's ultimately in some ways unlimited or infinite, but just that the human doesn't realize it. So we have that Atman, and it's this kind of core eternal soul, you might say. Not quite the same as a Greek notion of eternal soul, but there's a notion where it's like an unlimited, has this great divine potential in it. So in Buddhism, that's challenged, and the notion here is that it's actually that we don't have this fundamental I, or this fundamental soul. This is the teaching of what's called in Sanskrit is called anatman. So that you have that privative added on at the beginning, which just means no soul. Or sometimes in Pali, the other major language of Buddhism, it gets translated as anatta. So that just means, it's a very similar language to Sanskrit. It just, again, it means no soul. So the teaching is that we don't actually have a fundamental self, even though that's what, if our consciousness makes it seem like. So in Buddhism, the notion is that that's a sensoric projection. It's Maya, it's illusion, that's illusory, that we actually have to see that we're just a bundle of different things in our consciousness. So we're going to talk about that more in this as we proceed here. But just know that that's another fundamental aspect. So as we see in these, just to address these photos, we see the Buddha, an image of the Buddha up in the upper left. And so sitting in lotus position there. And then in the bottom, we have this is actually a form of Buddhism called Tibetan Buddhism. And Tibetan Buddhism is known as the Vajrayana path. There's other forms of Vajrayana Buddhism, but this is the most common form of Vajrayana. Vajrayana is actually part of the Mahayana tradition. So basically, we'll touch upon that later at the end of this presentation. But we see that it's kind of a later teachings that emerge within Buddhism, that they take on their own kind of emphasis. And so the one thing that makes Vajrayana, as a one example of Mahayana teachings, unique from other Mahayana teachings, is that it really has an emphasis on using ritual implements. It kind of defies actually what I was saying earlier about the shamanic aspect. So, there's it also was influenced by Tibetan shamanism. And so you have the recognition of a lot of different bodhisattvas. Um, you have different techniques that you're using the material world, and you're using sound, and you're using color. It's called tantra, is this coming from both Hindu and Buddhism, Indic religiosity. And the notion here is that there's certain vehicles that you can use. You can use desire. You can use certain magical mantras, and really spiritually transformative other practices that are kind of sometimes kept secret. And it allows a Buddhist practitioner, it is said, to gain liberation in a single lifetime, as opposed to the common notion that it otherwise would take many, many lifetimes of making more incremental progress. So, of course, that's coming from, it's a sectarian kind of rhetoric where, everyone can say that, different Buddhist pathways can say that. But the idea here is that, you're taking, you kind of taking more intense practices, you might say, and using like certain gurus. Anyway, there's a lot that I could say about Vajrayana Buddhism. I'll touch upon it later in this lecture, but just know that these people sitting here are doing this practice, and they're in the Himalayas. Um, and a lot of Tibetan Buddhists, after the communist takeover of Tibet in the late 1950s and going beyond then, um, they ended up having to go into exile, including the Dalai Lama. And so a lot of them are in northern India, but there are still many Tibetan Buddhists that live in Tibet, which is now technically a province of China. Um, so I actually don't know where they are here, but you see that they're out in this mountainous region. They're practicing this practice called Tumo. And I just wanted to bring it up because it's kind of interesting, noteworthy. This Tumo practice, Tumo refers to this heat energy that they're out there, and that through meditation, they're sort of focusing all their bodily and concentrative energies, and through this, advanced meditation practice, you might say, and then it allows them to generate heat. And so, in this, there's a practice involved here that I don't think they're actually doing it here, but the Tumo practice is this initiatory practice where these Tibetan monks, and in some cases nuns, will go out, and they have to generate this Tumo energy through entering into a deep meditative state, um, and then generate this heat that comes from like within the belly. And they actually have to dry. They have they could be wearing like wet clothing, wet garbs, that they have to, through all this heat that they're generating through this practice, you have to dry the garb that you're wearing. um, so in It sounds like a pretty extreme practice, and you could get sick out in the cold. So I get the sense that in some cases they just have them out there. They're not wet, but they have to just endure the coldness. And here, then, I'm not seeing them. I think that, as I've seen it be described, this practice, they would wear a lighter outfit. But I know that when I found this image looking up Tumo, and it said, that they're practicing this Tumo practice. So it's just kind of an interesting, I think it just illustrates that, maybe a case where, you have like a real pretty intense practice to go out there in the cold, and then generate your heat energy, and that's how you stay warm. And so it's kind of, an intense initiatory practice. Okay, so of course you all are free to research that on your own time, and I'll just leave it at that for now. Um, but so yeah, to move on here, getting into our first slide, after the cover slide, who is the Buddha? So touching on his historical life narrative. Some of this is said to be, either historical fact or upheld by the tradition, to have be rooted in, confirmed by multiple different sources within the Buddhist traditions. Um, but some of this is said to be kind of legendary, where it's based on the legend of the life story of the Buddha. So we don't know how much all of this actually happened, or if it was, some of it may have happened, but then it became kind of over time, um, embellished into more of a either clarified narrative or more of a dramatic narrative. So we are unclear about just how much of this all is true, but we know, but we understand that he was a prince of this clan, this Shakya clan, and he was of going back to the last week on caste. He was of the Kshatriya class, which is the of the basically aristocratic class and kings and administrators of the government. And so he had this lineage, and when he was said to be, he was when he was born, there was different prophecies that were made that he was going to become either a great ruler um, or a great sage. So in the case of becoming a ruler, the term is called a chakravartin, and it means like it's like a way of saying a ruler of all these kingdoms, like a unifier of all of India. So it's like he wouldn't just be this king of this local kingdom, but he's going to be this someone that takes over all of India and leads a kind of a golden age of prosperity, speaking in the sort of material sense. So, his father wanted this particular path for him. I don't know if he was envisioning, that'll be great for me, or just can think about all the fame and all the legacy of that. Um, but as the story goes, he had a vested interest in seeing his son go this particular direction, as opposed to, becoming this sage, which maybe he didn't really understand what that would entail, or what he would have it, how would that benefit him. So as the story goes, he ends up getting very shielded in his life. He grows up in a palace, and all of life is just hunky dory. And his dad actually his father makes a really a strong effort to keep him shielded from the messiness of life and the suffering of life, because he felt that if his son Siddhartha Gautama was his name, if his son Siddhartha were to see all of these things, it would lead him to renounce the material life, and go off and become an ascetic, as a lot of Hindu ascetics were already doing at this time. Um, so again, I don't think I mentioned the dates, but scholars will say he was in the sixth or fifth, overlapping into the fifth century BCE, and so the dates are actually 567 BCE to 487 BCE. So that's an 80 year, said to have died when he was 80 years old. And that's some scholars will have speculated that he was actually, for different reasons, they date him at a later time, about a century later, and there's disagreement about specific dates there. But there's no real reason necessarily to dispute these traditional dates. Um, and and just to know that in Jainism, there's another figure called, his name was Mahavir, and he had a very kind of similar narrative from the Jain tradition. He was also considered to be kind of this great prophet, or true seeker that gained liberation. And you can, if you ever look up the legacy of Mahavir for the Jains, you'll see kind of a similar life story unfold, and some similar teachings, because again, it is Jainism is a shamanic pathway as well. Um, so um, it's said that Mahavir was maybe 20 years or 30 years prior to Buddha. And so there's different debate about, was Mahavir really before the Buddha, and so on and so forth. And so you get different opinions about that. Um, but anyway, it's just know that there's a parallel there. But in the case of the Buddha, as I was saying, getting back kind of into this story, so eventually, he ends up marrying, and he has a wife, and he has a child, and but around the same time, he starts becoming a little bit disenchanted with the normal routine, and starts to be a tinge of incompleteness to his life. Um, and I think, you could maybe make it that there's kind of presented in the sense that because everything was so shielded, there was maybe a sense, almost like in the if anyone's seen the Truman Show, there's a sense that, like, there's a fakeness that, like, there's something that's missing from this equation, the way that his life was unfolding. And so in this case, he ends up um, what's called, as the story goes, there's these great bodhisattvas, or divine beings, that have to actually intervene to allow the Buddha to kind of go off course and go off of the beaten path. and be able to see these different sights, because again his father was guarding him from that. But he ends up basically escaping that, and going on a walking around the town, and he ends up seeing these the four, what is called the four sights. So the four sights include a person who is old, kind of, maybe hunched back over, and experiencing some of the unpleasantries of old age. He sees someone who is sick. Um, so again, experiencing the unpleasantries of being very sick, and everything that comes with that. And then he sees someone who is um, a corpse, someone who's dead. And so that was something that really hadn't, he hadn't really needed to reconcile with the finitude of life. That was also shielded from him. So he sees, a corpse. But then, so these are all very dispiriting sights that he comes across. And, it's like, okay, for the first time, he's seeing not just a little bit of suffering and a little bit of the kind of the ugliness of life and the messiness of life, but he's seeing a very strong, potent dose of it all at once. So this, naturally leads him to be like, wants to get to the bottom of it, and he's kind of depressed over it. But he does see in the last sight that he sees of the four sights, he sees a sage. So he sees what in the Hindu tradition is called a sannyasin. He sees this renouncer who, because they've been on this path for a long time. They have a certain kind of equanimity about themselves, a certain kind of peace, that the constancy of peace that the Buddha recognizes in the facial expression of this individual. And it leads him to kind of resolving that, okay, there's a path out of this kind of incompleteness, out of this kind of evident misery that underlies all of life, and that all of life kind of that one has to kind of meet their faith or go through this aspect of suffering and impermanence, that the things in life are subject to decay ultimately. And so this leads him to resolving that he has to go on the same path. And he ends up actually, and this is criticized by some people that look at the life story of the Buddha. But he ends up actually leaving. He just basically kisses his wife and his child, newborn son, in the middle of the night, and he just leaves, and he departs from them. And it ends up being kind of, that action ends up becoming defended later, because both his wife and his son, they end up joining the Sangha, the Buddhist community at this time, and become disciples. And as it said, they end up becoming liberated as well. So it kind of has a happy ending, despite what could be leveled towards the Buddha at this time as like grave familial abandonment and irresponsibility, obviously for leaving a wife and child like that. So anyway, but so he goes out, and then he ends up undergoing these different austerities. He meets not just, I think in the textbook it mentions that he meets up with 5 different practitioners, and that's true, and they later became disciples as well. But there's a variety of different teachings, teachers, and great kind of sages, as well as austerity practitioners that he ends up meeting, and he kind of masters all of their techniques. And it doesn't lead to the liberation that he's seeking, and he's doing this for many years. And as the textbook and as the narrative goes, he ends up becoming very, very frail. He's not eating, and he just has a kind of a skeleton as a body. And at some point he realizes that this doesn't have the secret towards, this isn't going to ultimately lead to my liberation. And so this whole insight about the middle way comes up as the story goes. One day he's hearing this person who's like tuning a guitar and trying to play the guitar. And when, as the story goes, when when the string is too loose, there's the person playing this instrument, the stringed instrument, it doesn't produce really any sound, or the sound is flat, you might say, but as the story is told, it's no sound. And then if it's too tight, the string can break. So that led to this notion that it's this epiphany, you might say, about this middle path. And for him, the extremes on both sides are self-indulgent, so kind of represented by his temple or palatial life that he had before, where it's just all the pleasure or comfort that he could have wanted, um, and just kind of giving into whatever the whims of the body and what one desires. And of course, being really rich and a prince, he was kind of allowed that. That was something that, great privilege that he was afforded to him. Um, and then the other end of the spectrum is austerity, or this notion of really asceticism, of pushing one's body to great extremes. Um, and so he ends up through his own life experience, he ends up rejecting that as well. Um, so eventually, then when he comes to this, he ends up finding this Bodhi tree and then meditating under it. And he meditates for this long time. He kind of sets the resolve to, once and for all, get to the very bottom of things or truth of things. And he ends up just confronting his egoity, and then, he ends up achieving nirvana, liberation. So it's through this kind of deep introspective process that he goes through that he arrives at this. Um, and then this would then, lead to his teachings on the Four Noble Truths, and how, this particular method that he uses for the realization that he comes to. So this is kind of just a very broad sketch of his life. And at the photo down at the bottom on the left, you see the four sights that are represented there. So you see the person that's hunched over, the person in old age. You see the person that appears to be sick. And then you see the corpse, and then you see the sage in a meditation posture. And then on the right, we see, these are just different, going through a more detailed version of his life story. You see all these different incidents in his life. One thing I want to draw your attention to before we move on to the next slide, um, is this. You see that there's a person on the right, on the third one up on the right hand column, um, of these little circles that show different images. There's a person with an arrow. So this is representing what's called the parable, or the teaching of the arrow. And it's a really important teaching in Buddhism that kind of is paradigmatic of a lot of, or representative of a lot of the different teachings that the Buddha, it kind of gets at a lot of different values that he teaches, or some of the core teachings. So the whole notion, so it's a pretty powerful metaphor. The whole notion is that he's teaching his disciples one day, and he said, okay, if you were to get shot with this arrow, um, okay, well, what is the most advisable or wise thing to do? Are you gonna, is the person going to all of a sudden start asking all these questions about, you know, I wonder, like, what the person who shot me with this arrow, I wonder what caste that they're from. I wonder what their name is. I wonder, what their family is, or what region they're from. I wonder about the arrow itself. I wonder about what particular, what is what is the type of stone that the arrowhead is made of? What is the type of tree that that they got the wood for the shaft of the arrow from? And it's kind of this ridiculous notion that, why would you think about all those things? The right action to take is obviously to just pull the arrow out and not concern yourself with these things at this kind of vital time. Because if you just leave the arrow in there and you start thinking about all of it, in the meantime you're going to die. Um, and so it's just a metaphor that ends up being, about it. It's about, the folly or the limitedness of philosophical speculation. So, it's like the notion that if you're, head centered philosophical person, or you have, you're kind of on this quest for knowledge. At some point, there's a limit to it. That, it doesn't end up leading to any sort of practical liberation. It's just, you can gain more knowledge, and you can kind of have, endless speculation and debate about the minutia philosophical points. But at some point, according to his teachings, he's saying you actually have to act, and you have to, apply the teachings, because at some point the universe is very complex, and you can't understand all of it. But there's these, my teachings kind of give you this practical instructions or practical cure on how you can, sort of become wise and become happy within the universe, not necessarily having every answer laid out in a philosophical sense, or learned every bit of knowledge in the universe, but which in a sense is kind of attempting, and then that's how I think a lot of people are maybe wired that way in a certain sense. But he's saying there that at some point, if you just do the if you take refuge in the Buddha's teachings, if you take refuge in my Dharma, then and apply these teachings, that is the best course of action. So it's just this power. I probably could have told the story better, but this parable of the arrow is getting at this kind of the folly and limitedness of philosophical speculation, and and of knowledge, and it's kind of this practical emphasis, that or pragmatic approach of Buddhism, that don't concern yourself too much with all the riddles and all the talk and all the knowledge, but just take the right action and take this kind of practical approach to your life. Take these teachings are we can keep it fairly simple, the Four Noble Truths, and just apply this as a sort of medicine for your life. So we see how these are it's these temptations, that is sort of this practical instruction regarding that. Okay, so to move on to this next slide. So we see the Four Noble Truths. I want to go through this relatively quickly, if that's okay, just because I know that Minda Lee Kumar addresses it in great depth, and I think she does an outstanding job of it. It's just explaining how it's not just we can't think of suffering just as this ultimate ultimate thing in life. It's something that is all these kind of subtle ways that it undergirds our everyday realities. According to her, she's talking about how we have all these kind of expectations about things in the world, like we have a lot of things at stake, little things like maybe I want to be in the relationship with this person, or how do I look today, or financial worries, or all these little kind of things and she also makes the point how sometimes we want something, but even when we end up getting it, we still realize that we're not happy. And so it's even when we get the fulfillment of our material desires or other desires, sometimes that doesn't really lead to happiness, because it's this ultimate kind of this desire that underscores, and the natural impermanence of life, that all these things kind of end up with. It's almost like we're chasing a ghost. And so I think she does a really wonderful job of explaining that. I would just add a couple points onto this, where so we're talking about dukkha. Dukkha is the word for suffering, and one kind of interesting analogy that I've heard, in my past education from a previous instructor that's taught me. I really like it. I thought it was kind of funny. He mentioned, like, you go in. Has anybody gone into so this is actually based on the core Buddhist teaching about dukkha. The word, the etymological root of the word is, it goes back to this notion of like a broken axle on on an ox cart or on a chariot, that this wheel that's carrying this vehicle, that if the axle is broken, you see that it's all wobbly and it doesn't move well. And that's actually like this an important notion of how dukkha is understood by Buddhists, which is like there's something that's fundamentally kind of out of place, and there's everything is kind of tinged with this incompleteness or the suffering. And so I heard a funny analogy about this that's kind of extended into a modern day context. And this former instructor of mine, he said, has anybody like gone to the grocery store, and you get like the one cart that has like a broken wheel on it, and you're trying to move the cart, and it's kind of like ends up veering when you push it forward, ends up kind of veering into almost hitting someone else's cart, or it kind of like drags along. And it's just like, so I don't know how by percentage how many of these shopping carts are like that, but we've all kind of had that kind of shopping cart where it's like trying to move it around. It slows you down. It's like maybe it's making these sounds that are annoying, and it's like fundamentally like you just wish that you had a cart that worked. It was just, again, he told it in a funnier way than I can tell it, but I think it's like it's something that we can relate to, and it does kind of relate back to this traditional notion of dukkha. And then we see it. So this is the first truth, that the suffering is a part of life and it pervades life at a certain level, and that we all kind of come to it kind of culminates in our life when we all do grow old, or we maybe lose someone tragically from our family, or when we approach we're confronted with our own death and our own mortality, and some of the suffering that comes with that. And so it's there, and it just kind of looms, and eventually we kind of have to face that. So that's dukkha. Um, the word tanha, or in Sanskrit, the word is called Trishna, and so you see a lot of parallels there. Um, but the word, yeah, so this is a word that means like desire. It can mean attachment. It's translated in different ways. I like the word attachment. It also has, I think, a really good translation for it is thirst. So it's kind of this like, and that's why I show this image. You might be wondering about, why am I showing this image of this person grabbing for the water? It's kind of this fundamental thirst that we all have at all, that kind of just, from a Buddhist perspective, pervades our consciousness and our being at all times, and you don't really escape it. Sometimes you maybe quench it, but then it's fleeting, or evanescent, where that satisfaction only lasts so long, and then we want something else. So it's kind of this ongoing thirst, that unless you address that thirst according to these teachings, then it's just going to keep kind of repeating itself. Um, and so that then again is, from a Buddhist perspective, that's samsara, that's the cycle that keeps us in a kind of in this world of suffering through multiple lifetimes, and in within our stages in our life, and as we seek fulfillment and happiness, it's this desire that gets in the way. Um, and so, so according to just to look at this again, yeah, so thirst and clinging. Clinging is a really good way, I think, a good description of it, a sense of clingingness, that you just feel like you're dependent upon all these things, um, that your happiness is kind of feeble. Um, so then Nirodha is the truth of the cessation. It's basically just, you add the first two together, and this is what you kind of logically conclude, that to cease suffering, or to stop suffering and become liberated, you have to confront desire. So to eradicate suffering, you have to address the tanha. You have to basically if you look at it, think of it like a faucet. You have to look at that, and shut that desire. You have to look at it deeply and over time, and then see how you stop falling for that desire. Um, stop And then just, the notion really is like a sense of watching it. So and whether it is all these different steps that one takes, and we see the eightfold path here on the right, depicted in the right, or through meditation. It's kind of, the notion is like, it's almost like, you think of like a lake on a really windy day, and it's really choppy. Um, Maybe there's like, we might imagine there's different currents that are going beneath the water, and the sense is that this lake, just by just letting it sit. So the lake is like, maybe our consciousness has all these waves of fear, and of wantingness, and all these, all this turbulence, this mental turbulence, and all the different worries and concerns that we have. And we just watch that, and we just observe it, and try not to react to it, but just let it sit, and just watch how it kind of how a thought or a desire arises. And then the sense is that, don't to just not be tempted to follow it, or be fooled by it, but just to watch it, and watch it, and watch it. And over time, that whole system, that whole lake, all these different waves, these thoughts, these desires, end up all the turbulence of that ends up gradually becoming calmer and calmer. And then that's when you have, kind of this more pure insight can arise, and this peacefulness and happiness, this more stability. But that's in a Buddhist tradition. It takes that notion is, you're confronting your egoity that goes so deep into the human psyche, and then of course you're dealing with life itself, which is the Buddha's teaching on the law of impermanence, that everything is always changing. So it's a, that the notion here is that it's a very difficult thing to do, to just be able to stay in this kind of centered place where you're just watching this unfold, and and then not letting oneself act on one's this tanha, this desire within. So the notion is that this is kind of just laying out. This is the kind of the prescription on how to this is kind of the cure. This third one, but then there has to be kind of this specific prescriptions, because life is a dynamic, complex thing, and so there's actually like and we're also talking about karma again. So karma plays in to Buddhism. So if we're taking the right ethical action, and behaving kindly and compassionately, then that leads to easier path. It leads to that lake becoming calmer as well. I really like how, if you were, and I hope everyone has been looking at Professor Frickenberg's, Sarah Frickenberg's slides, her slideshows, which is, I think, I thought they're so great that I could have just I wanted you all to just to see it, to get a different perspective, and just to have all this stuff be reinforced further. So I hope that they've been helpful. But I really like how she explains this concept as like, there's a sense that if one has bad karma, when one goes down to watch either through meditation or just in the process of their lives, while they're practicing this Buddhist practice of what's called mindfulness, they're watching the tanha, the desire, that it's going to be a lot harder to do if one has a sense of guilt about what one's done, or if one's actively angry, or is kind of stoking the fire of desire in various ways. And so the notion there is that one's karma, one's the right or wrong actions that one has done, really makes a big difference when it comes to this process of trying to calm one's total system, and make spiritual progress according to these Four Noble Truths. So we see that, like, for instance, a really practical aspect to this is right livelihood. So you're doing this really has mainly two components. One, that it's largely a non-violent, so you're not causing other harm to other beings. And then the other aspect of right livelihood is that it promotes or allows some practice of mindfulness while you're doing that activity itself. So we can think of different occupations that lend themselves to that more than others. But the notion is there that it's important to get this right livelihood where you can practice kind of, while you're on the job, so to speak. And then, I don't want to go into all of these different components. But another, I do like how she, in that slide, she rightly points out that this has like the right view or right understanding component, and you see that with the first a couple of these the stokes of this wheel, the Noble Eightfold Path, and then you get into the ethical dimensions with right speech and right action, and again right livelihood, and then the last of them, diligence, mindfulness, concentration. It's more of this process of introspection, of meditation practice, that where you see that this is where the Buddha's teachings, and he has a lot of teachings on these aspects, but that's where it really, after you've kind of laid the foundation with the ethical and the right understanding, then you can go deeper into these other practices. So you see that they all kind of work together. It's not necessarily just linear where it's, but it cycles around, but there's a sense in which the others support the ethical, and the understanding is, the deeper meditation is predicated on these other steps. So I'm just looking to see if there's anything other point I want to make on this slide. I think that pretty much covers it. Again, I hope I think the Minna Lee Kumar video is pretty powerful in the way that she explains some of this. So I hope that was helpful to see that as well. Okay, so to continue along. Let me see. I'm just checking the time here on the video recording too. Oh wow, okay. I'm already I'm already going over. So I think I had said that in the lecture I was going to try to keep this to 30 to 40 minutes, and I see that I've already gone over somehow. So I don't have too many slides left, but I'm gonna try to go kind of speed through the rest of them so I can keep this to under an hour, hopefully. So let's see, I have, I think, about 6 or 7 more slides, but just allow me to go through each of these pretty quickly. So, this first one is the teaching of anatta. I just want to go circle back to this notion. So again, in Hinduism, they teach that there's Atman. Everyone has this kind of soul. And here, this is a really important teaching in Buddhism about there's ultimately no self or soul. That it ultimately, there's no, you don't dig eventually and get to this core essential part of the self. And so this is explained through the skandhas or bundles. So you have all these kind of constituent, fundamental, underlying constituent elements. The rupa is material form, all the feelings, the perception, mental formations, and consciousness. All of those work together dynamically to produce this notion of self. But if you were to, if a person could kind of do an archaeological or excavation on oneself, they would see that all of these are kind of different elements that you can take apart, and that okay, and then from a Buddhist perspective, if you take all of those individual parts that collectively create consciousness, what do you have at the end? So a Hindu would say there's still this infinite soul. A Buddhist would say there's this notion of emptiness or nothingness, and so it's like there's this is a complex topic, and it's debated by scholars because there's a sense in which maybe they're saying kind of the same thing at an ultimate level. Um, so it kind of ends the notion that you end up at a higher reality, for instance, and so there's different terms. The Buddhists might call this nirvana, and a Hindu might call this Brahman. Um, and so there's different ways where you could say that they're kind of talking about the same thing, and others will have the opinion that they're talking about totally different things. Um, but regardless, the notion here is that there's a real emphasis in Buddhism on confronting the self. So you're looking at it and you're always kind of checking. You're being on guard against what are one's own thoughts, what are one's own desires, and this sort of like hubris of the self, the egoity of the self, that naturally um, kind of bubbles up all the time. That is always kind of like one is from a Buddhist standpoint, one is always kind of watching that and being on guard against that. So this teaching ends up having a real practical dimension to it or application, where you're constantly being on guard of like questioning this notion of self. And so anyway, you in these images, you see this top image. I'm just saying that all these different gears end up producing this larger aspect of consciousness. And there's also some scientific materialist um, notions of consciousness emerging from all the different brain waves and cellular structure and all the different things that sometimes it's expressed as like um, everything is just chemicals and wires. Consciousness ultimately goes down to the chemicals and wires that are in the brain, and so this is one understanding that I don't think science definitively establishes this, but in looking at some of the data, there's different ways that you can say, okay, that consciousness is really, from a certain perspective, you could say that it comes down to all these different core elements of the human body and the human brain. Um, so that's a similar kind of notion to this notion of the skandhas, these bundles. Um, and then this analogy of the chariot just gets at this notion. It's kind of this metaphor where, okay, so the chariot exists as a referent that we all understand it practically. You can actually get on a chariot and arrive to a palace on a chariot, or arrive, Cinderella or whatever. I think they were riding a pumpkin chariot, if I'm not mistaken, but or carriage. But anyway, you look at like um, all of the different elements again, like the wheel and then the axle and then the carriage itself, the reins, if we want to include the horse just for the sake of the example as being part of the kind of the chariot, that you can include them as well. So the notion that someone comes on a chariot, we're saying the chariot, that has a practical dimension. Or we could say in the case of like another example, excuse, I would say maybe like in the case of um, like a chair. If we take like the legs of a chair, the again, it's not that great of an example because there's only so many. There's only a couple. I realize that's why I was trying to come up with a better example. Um, but so let's say like a modern example, just to take a car, because there's a lot of different like the seats inside of a car. You have the obviously the wheels and the engine and headlights, all of these different things, but they all come from, let's say, different factories. Let's just pretend for sake of argument, they're different parts that are assembled together. So the car is really an assemblage of all these different parts. And so the notion here is just that these parts of the chariot can be likened to these different parts that produce the sense of consciousness and produce the sense of self. But from a Buddhist perspective, this is all kind of this big illusion that we think that's the way it is, and we think it all comes down to this fundamental I. But if we were to see the truth, it would really be all these different bundles or aspects that come together that trick us into thinking that. And so, there was never, before the car was created, there was nothing like really there that produced the car. It was only after everything was kind of constructed and pieced together that the notion of practically speaking, this car emerges. So that's just it's a way of kind of looking at reality and kind of playing with that and maybe coming to some insight there. Um, and so that's where this classical Buddhist metaphor of the chariot comes into play. Um, Okay, so to continue, this is just this another. So anatta is actually one of the what's called the three marks of existence, which is another kind of core Buddhist teaching. This is another one called impermanence. The law of impermanence is a really important Buddhist notion that basically everything in the world is subject, ourselves, different relationships that we have, even empires, they come and they go. Everything is subject to decay. Um, and so this ultimately, you see, and I really like how Sogyal Rinpoche's work gets into this on the Tibetan Book of the Living and Dying. So that's like considered to be this classic book, and so he's in that book, Reflection and Change, discussing that chapter, discussing how kind of the notion of impermanence as applied to the self. We all have this mortal dimension, and we can actually use that as a lever for, if we confront the death and the impermanence of our lives, we can kind of adopt some wisdom about it, and we can kind of move with the flow of that. And we're not going to we're not going to have the expectation that the things that we cherish are going to last for too long. And when we realize that, the notion is that then we can actually enjoy it because we're not attached to it. We're not clinging to it. There's a sense that we can just let it be and see it as precious because, by virtue of the fact that it may not last forever. Here's this classic kind of image of the flow of a river, and to represent change, ever recurring change. On this right, there's this poster that I thought was really cool about happiness and kind of compassion in the Buddhist tradition. That you can kind of play with this idea. I had actually bought this as a poster for my mother one time back in the day, as a kind of a gift that I thought she would like, and so I wanted to share it as a kind of a cool. I like that just to contemplate this what it means. And so this notion of sharing happiness, and it's this inexhaustible source. And then you see this kind of flame within, this kind of compassionate flame that, if you think about it, it's maybe something to think about. Is happiness, can we just share it and increase it? Is it a finite resource, or is it unlimited? So it's just something to kind of think about there, in addition to kind of taking in the cool aesthetic of that poster. So again, as a final point on this slide, we see that in that chapter of the Tibetan Living and Dying chapter, we do see this notion, the story about this person who is diagnosed with a terminal illness, and this is a true story, who goes to this Tibetan. It turns out to be a Tibetan guru in New York City. and his name is I think you pronounce it Dudjom Rinpoche, this master, and this person is really in crisis because they received this diagnosis, and it's really, of course, tragic and sad, and this person is kind of in this state of hysteria almost, and they come to this master, um, and as the story tells, is telling, I'm dying, like what can I do, like, help me. And it's like this desperate plea, and then it's just what this master says, like, look, like, we're all dying, life is finite, we're all gradually dying, we're all going to meet our final day. And so in a way, you're not in this totally separate category. We all have this amount of time that we need to make the most of, while we have it, um, and and so it kind of just that's ends up being, this really empowering thing to hear, and this person ends up, kind of having this epiphany or insight from it, and then he's given these teachings as well, and then as the story goes, they end up, miraculously healing from this illness. And across religious traditions, we have cases where one's faith can lead to the miraculous. And I don't think we need to get into whether or not that's scientifically verifiable or not. But there's just an aspect here that these teachings end up being so empowering for this person, bringing this great epiphany and happiness and insight, and then along with the practice, the specific practices that this person was given, they even end up actually, like, healing, becoming healed. So I thought that was a really cool story that kind of illustrates the wisdom of impermanence. Um, okay, so to move on, and I want to go even quicker now. I'm running out of time. So we have the triple gem. This is just to know that this refers to, and when you become a Buddhist, you say that you want to take refuge, a vow to take refuge in each of these aspects, each of these three aspects. So recognizing the Buddha existed, and the story, the legacy. Um, take refuge in the Buddha. I take refuge in the Dharma. We know that this word comes up in Hinduism, the Dharma. Just know that this is the same term, but the term Dharma is what would be called polyvalent. It has a lot of different meanings. So this is kind of a particular meaning or connotation that's different than what I was saying for Hinduism, where it's duty, and it has a lot of meanings within Hinduism as well. It can mean religion, it can mean duty, it can mean ethical action. But here it ends up meaning just the teachings of the Buddha. So referring to the corpus of teachings, that everything that the Buddha taught. And so it's the notion you could take refuge, or the teachings themselves can be kind of a sanctuary that can, save a person from the life of suffering and samsara, and everything that kind of was outlined by Mindali Kumar. Um, and then lastly, the Sangha. This is considered to be another thing that you kind of take refuge in, and the notion that you have these people that are on the same path and are, kind of experiencing the same intense unfolding of their journey. Um, and they can provide a support there, and there's kind of this fellowship of spiritual seekers, you might say. And there's just a notion that that's a really important aspect of, where people can kind of show each other their blind spots and grow together, and push each other to meditate more, and everything that comes with being more compassionate. So here we see a Sangha kind of represented by these Japanese nuns in this photo on the right. And in the Zen tradition, meditation is called Zazen. And in that particular tradition, you do there's it is emphasized to practice a lot. Meditation is actually emphasized pretty heavily in that tradition. Um, and then on this left, just to note it, these are said to be the Buddha's last words. And these words very much illustrate, by the way, the shamanic thing, the self-effort. So he says, all conditioned things are impermanent. Work out your own salvation with diligence. So that is very much a shamanic statement, where they're saying, you take it upon yourself. No one can do it for you, and you're not going to get it from the grace of some deity. You need to kind of work it out yourself. So that ends up being in the Mahayana tradition. There's all these exceptions to that, where there's bodhisattvas that can kind of intervene, and there's different levels, notions of, like, a guru can provide a lot of insight or even energetic empowerment in the case of Tibetan Buddhism. So there end up being exceptions to that, but that's one of the kind of the key distinctions of this early tradition of Theravada, which I'll circle back to in just a second. Okay, to go, this next slide is looking at it's called the Bhava Chakra, the wheel of becoming is how you translate that. Bhava, the becoming, and wheel is chakra. We saw that word chakra the wheels of the Kundalini that we talked about last week. Um, so just know that there's 6 different dimensions where in this is really representing samsara, these different realms that you land in, these different lifetime. You could take birth as a human, which is considered actually to be the most auspicious birth that one can have. Um, or it could be a god in the realm of the gods, or the devas, or the demigods, asuras, or the animal realm. You could be reborn as an animal in the system, or realm of hungry ghosts, and then lastly the realm of hell beings. All of this is because of one's karma, and all of it is based on this again, going back to this thirst. I want to bring your attention to the very innermost circle of this whole wheel. This is kind of known as a mandala, this great image. Um, and so you see there a snake, you see a bird, and you see a boar or a pig. And so these are actually representative of what's in Buddhism called the 3 poisons. So these are really strong, kind of afflicted emotions that, of course, we all experience throughout our lives in various ways. Um, but they end up being like considered to be potent in a damaging manner. So that's why I'd say poisonous. That they end up fueling our own kind of samsaric entrenchment, you might say. So the idea here is that uh, raga let's see. Um, the raga is the attachment, and that's represented by the bird. This is a particular kind of bird that is known. Why did they pick a bird is kind of the question. This is a bird in India that ended up that is known for having like really be like kind of a attachment to its young. So there's this particular bird that they observed that was like really attached to its young. So that's why they chose this particular bird, because you might wonder why would it be a bird. And then in the snake is a represent of aversion. This is a term called Vesha, and so that's another. So we have this really strong attachment. Sometimes raga is also translated, by the way, as lust. So we have attachment, and that was one of the ways that Trishna was translated. But here, the raga is like a kind of seen as a more intense form of that, where it can even be like a sensual lust thing, where it's like this really deep desire. Like you have to have some, kind of something, that kind of an analogous kind of desire. So that is the attachment, and then the snake is the aversion. So like, it can be translated as hatred or resentment. Like this really kind of hot fire of oppositional feeling that we maybe have towards someone. And so that's a kind of considered to be a poisonous or toxic emotion for Buddhism. These are these things that you really, like a Buddhist, would really want to avoid and be on guard against. And then we see lastly, the boar is, or the pig is represented what's called moha, which is delusion. So it's like, not being aware of what the Buddha's prescriptions of reality are, and not seeing that, kind of getting fooled by our expectations, or getting fooled by thinking things are permanent, and or thinking things that like this is also something that Mindali Kumar really insightfully touched upon, the notion that kind of like leasing the present for the future. So always thinking that we're going to arrive at some point down the road, I'm going to become happy, or when I'm able to retire, that's when everything is going to be, grand and hunky dory. And then, a lot, and then we have this kind of notion that, okay, well then you have like 3 year, however many years you have left to live at that time, and then it's like, at that time you become older and you can't do all these things anymore that maybe you would have been able to enjoy when one was younger. That's a whole other kind of can of worms, of course. But the notion is just that, having these expectations for the future can sometimes prevent enjoying or relishing the moment, or even experiencing the moment. Um, so that's moha, having this delusion, and so all of these things, having ignorant, and so there's a kind of a notion of ignorant behaviors or ignorant understanding, like really being caught and not understanding with having any sort of wisdom. And so these are actually like it's just important to know that these kind of like just will naturally self-perpetuate, and one needs to kind of intervene by watching them. And there's also as the teachings go, that there's generosity can offset attachment, or so giving gifts, or like thinking of others, taking care of others. Dana is the word for that. Metta, which is known as loving kindness, that can, so instead of feeling aversion towards someone, it's really hard. The notion here is that's really hard to just, this is kind of a natural human thing to eventually, like you um, you know, I don't know, like if you're around your family at Christmas time for too long or something, that eventually there's this kind of inbuilt animosity or just, that maybe that's a bad analogy, but it's just like there's a lot of ways where that it's a natural thing to kind of feel aversion at some point. And so you can't just, why it's so built in that you have to do something active to replace it with something else. And so in the Buddhist tradition, that's called metta, or loving kindness. So if you actively practice this strong intention for loving kindness, that's actually the best way to heal your, or to turn your attention away from the natural propensity to feel aversion, or jealousy or anger, or whatever it is. So that's a really important notion. And then the last one, what I mentioned, delusion. So the opposite of what that is called prajna, or wisdom. So you have like you're keeping the teachings of the Buddha in mind, and gaining like a real clear sense of them. Um, so that's that can either also include having a teacher to guide one's way, or to look at the teachings of the Buddha specifically and go back to them. Um, so that's all these different. I'm trying to think if I want to say anything further about these six realms of the Bhava Chakra. Um, I think just to know that even though it's ranked third, the gods, you don't want to be. Why is it most suspicious to be human? You don't want to be in the gods is great. Sometimes the notion, okay, great, you ended up in this heavenly realm based on having good karma, but the notion that why that's not ranked as high as being a human is because in a Buddhist tradition, you actually need, just like the Buddha's life, you need that adversity, you need the suffering. Otherwise, you're not going to grow. Otherwise, you're not going to confront the egoity. So this notion that it's great in this heavenly realm, and all this great, whatever one's pleasures are, that can be fulfilled, and it's great, at beautiful, jeweled, um, aesthetic, great, paradise basically. But because one isn't able to confront their own suffering, or confront their own fundamental selfhood and egoity, that person will never be able to gain liberation in this realm. So they have to be still reborn as a human in order to achieve that. There's a Buddhist tradition where that's not the case. It's called Pure Land Buddhism. But in the most case, again, the Shramanic path, or emphasis in Buddhism, says that you have to be a human. You have to suffer intensely to be able to transcend the suffering. And then the demigods, that's just these other kind of like, is more of these beings of competition and jealousy, and they have great power, but it's just a limit. It's another realm that basically you can notion. And then the hell beings, hell is not a common concept in Buddhism. Most of the time, the notion is that you'll be reborn as maybe an animal or a human, or whatever. But then there, and then that has enough suffering in it, but only for people who are really wicked or really bad, and had really bad karma. They might go to this hell realm. It is in China and in Japan. There are there are these kind of hell realms that are somewhat common within those traditions, where there's a notion of like you want to try to avoid these really bad these going there, and so there's different practices and stuff, beliefs about that. But for the most part, it's in Buddhism, it's not there's not a really an emphasis on these realms. Most of the understanding would be people avoid it. Okay, so I've said all I want to say on that. And then just the last aspect of this presentation, and I think I'm probably going to be going over a little over an hour, unfortunately, but I'll make this fast regardless. So the main one, as you saw in the textbook, is Theravada. It's a little bit more of a conservative path. It's based on the kind of the Buddha's teachings before later Buddhists end up drawing out different teachings of them. So at the time of the Buddha, he didn't include too much philosophical, you could say, elaboration. It wasn't about it wasn't making metaphysical points or trying to answer questions about ultimate reality. And we talked about that parable, that arrow, in the kind of the foundational Buddhist precedent for why that's the case. But later in Mahayana, these questions inevitably emerged. And so there's different teachings that end up, and then it can be connected back to different things that the Buddha said. So it's elaborating on his teachings, but it's the notion of like, okay, what is fundamental existence? What does that kind of boil down to? So what is the world? Is it eternal? All these questions. So in this tradition, it becomes important. In the Mahayana tradition, it becomes this emphasis becomes placed upon all the world is like saturated or fundamentally defined by emptiness. There's just emptiness, that everything changes, all impermanent. But a part of that is that, it depends on the tradition. They'll say different traditions will say different things. But there's a notion that the universe is also Buddha nature. So there's like Buddha nature is all pervades all of reality. And there's a sense that it's almost like when you wake up to that, which is already is, then in that you can kind of like absorb or sorry, like kind of melt, you might say, or how do I put it? That there's a way in which you can kind of become aligned with this Buddha nature, which has always been there and is all existent, and you can kind of go into this fundamental substratum of reality. And meditation, because it's already there, there's a potential to wake up to it instantly. That's kind of what I was kind of circling around here, because Buddha nature is fundamental to the universe. It's it can be kind of this understood as this notion of wisdom of emptiness, or in a sense it's kind of this infinite notion of unlimited unconditioned reality is this Buddha nature. And if someone, since it's everywhere, if someone according to a Mahayana understanding, if one can simply, it's there, someone can just wake up to it. It's like that's a part of reality. It's a part of the innermost of oneself as well. So, and you see this expressed very clearly in the Zen tradition, which is Mahayana in Japan. There's a sense that like one can reach like an instant enlightenment. So this is called satori. And you see that expressed by the koans, where like a certain question, like what's the sound of one hand clapping, it can sometimes lead to this instant kind of like you just are able to now grasp this suchness of the universe. And so just to know that in the Theravada tradition, there isn't this kind of, it's like it's understood to be more of this gradual process that one has to like gradually calm that lake a little bit by a little bit. And so it might take more lifetimes, but it definitely involves one's self-effort over a gradually unfolding process. But in Mahayana tradition, there's a sense that you never know when someone could just wake up and spontaneously to this Buddha nature. So that has all these different other important contexts associated with it. But the other thing is that there's an emphasis on compassion in both cases, but you see it a little bit more emphasized in Mahayana Buddhism. And one of the reasons for that is in Mahayana Buddhism, there's is emphasis placed upon these beings called bodhisattvas. And bodhisattvas are like kind of like unseen deities, you might say, but they're said to be beings that got all the way to the point of liberation. So they did all the spiritual work and gained all the insight to the point where they were ready to achieve nirvana. They're at the very end of their existence. But instead of going to this place of nirvana, of which the Buddha didn't really speak about, he just said it was a cessation of suffering. But instead of going to this place that's like kind of presumably out of this whole world or out of this whole cycle of samsara, the notion is that they stay around in the world to help others, to teach others, to be a compassionate vessel for others to kind of draw upon. Um, and so that's this notion of a bodhisattva. It's an ideal. The belief is that there's bodhisattvas out there in the world, and that and you see it in Tibetan Buddhism, the Vajrayana path again. That there's you go to a Buddhist temple, there's all these different bodhisattvas or icons of bodhisattvas that one can like make a donation to, and then there's a sense of grace that comes from the bodhisattva. Um, but it's also this ideal that one aspires to. It's like the notion of I'm not even want to desire this liberation because I want to, what would be even better is I get to a point where I can help others. So it's this really clear emphasis on compassion. Um, and so just to know that that's part of the Mahayana tradition as well, fundamental aspect. So you see the Japanese Zen nun image. So she's from the Mahayana. That's a Mahayana tradition. In the Theravadan monks in the upper, as a group of male monks, there's a little bit more of a rigid gender separation traditionally in Theravadan Buddhism. Um, and then you see of course the Dalai Lama, who many of you I think are probably familiar with. And so that is again Tibetan Buddhism and Vajrayana, this path. He's actually said to be a bodhisattva that took a human incarnation. So that he's said to be this bodhisattva, this divine being, basically this almost liberated being, um, who it's called the deed is called Avalokiteshvara, and it's this great bodhisattva that different cultures know by different names. Um, but the idea there is in the Dalai Lama that this is the 14th incarnation of the succession of different incarnations of this fundamental teacher, this political and spiritual leader of Tibet. So they'll track, like, when he passes away, they'll in like 7 years from that point forward, they'll try to find, okay, where among born into the Tibetan people is this same individual. So that's this whole other thing too. But anyway, that's just the notion of the Dalai Lama down here. That's an example of Vajrayana, and you do see like prayer wheels incorporated into Buddhism, mandalas, mantras. So again, you're using kind of these tools, or even one's own desire. You're going with that flowing with that feel like some Tibetan paths actually like invite what's called like like even a sexual dimension of tantra, that it's basically like not trying to suppress those feelings, but like using it as you see if you look up online an image of a yab-yum, it's actually you see this like erotic embrace of a male and a female, but it's also representing of insight and compassion, both of those aspects. Um, but it's just there's a sense of like inviting, to moving with whatever the is the material flow in the world, as opposed to like pushing it away. So that's just this notion within um, um, Tibetan Buddhism, the Vajrayana path. And again, that's called the diamond vehicle path, because it's the notion that it's like a diamond is just this adamantine, like it's just going to cut through all these other obstacles that another path teachings might get caught up in. This is like the best path or something. So that's of course again from a sectarian perspective, and all the different forms of Buddhism can make their own cases for superiority or directness of pathway as well. Um, Lastly, just to show you a form of Pure Land Buddhism, which is a popular form of Buddhism, and especially East Asia and Japan and China, um, and in parts of Southeast Asia as well. And so here the notion is that the notion here is that we're in this what's called the Kali Yuga. In Japan, it's called Mappo, this degenerate age. We're in an age where it cycles through. You have ages where it's a lot easier to become liberated and there's less suffering in the world. And then there's ages where it's like, all these negative emotions and wicked actions are on the rise, and it's really hard to become liberated at this time. This teaching, and so that's what Buddhism teaches already. But this form of Pure Land Buddhism actually says that you can't actually even gain liberation during this age. So you have to go to this Pure Land in order to become liberated, where so based on one's merit and one's karma and the faith that one has, maybe in a bodhisattva, they go to this Pure Land after they're reborn in this Pure Land, where then they can become liberated. And there's a lot of different texts and traditions that present different versions of this Pure Land. And it's kind of like a paradise too. You can kind of see the image here of this kind of this blissful celestial realm of the clouds and everything. This pure light emanating from this forehead of this a Buddha that's in this Pure Land, and that's sometimes called Amida Buddha in Japan. So it can also, there's a notion here that it's this a land of bliss as well, but sometimes it can be either a place of liberation, or it's like this bliss that you're there for, it's kind of this notion of heaven. So there's difference of opinion there. So that was the final slide actually. And obviously there's a lot of dimensions of Buddhism that I wasn't able to explore in this video lecture. But I do hope that some of this was helpful for kind of adding some further clarifications and just building upon certain points that were emphasized in the readings and in the videos, as well as in the Fisher chapter. So again, I really look forward to reading each of your discussion posts for this week. And have a great rest of your day. And thank you for listening to this video lecture.